You have to be tough as a damn boot to be good, because you have to stand your ground when you need to stand your ground, and you have to be able to say no when it's time to say no, and you have to mean it. And so then you have to think and plan strategically so that when you're going to say no, you can mean it and it will stick. And that takes a certain amount of integrated malevolence, I would say. And once it's integrated, it's not malevolence, it's strength. It's strength of character. It's the ability to stand your ground. And you have to cultivate that. And you cultivate that at least in part by telling the truth. And so you take your place in the world as a decent person and as a decent citizen, and you play the hierarchical game properly. And that is to stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's like the world's an onslaught. You've got the tyranny of culture to deal with. You've got the catastrophe of nature. You've got your own damn malevolence and ignorance, right? All coming at you. Plus the incredible, complicated, indeterminate potential of the future. That's all coming at you. And it's all your responsibility. And you can cringe away from it and be afraid of it and be victimized by it and be bitter and cynical about it. And no wonder, because it can be painful. Or you can turn around and you can say, man, bring it on. Because there's more to me than there is to the catastrophe. And this is what I discovered from looking at what I looked at. I looked at the darkest things I could look at. Really, for 30 years. I was really a lot of fun to be around, I can tell you. I looked at the darkest things that I could think of, right? Not only what happened in Auschwitz and what happened in the Gulag, but personal issues. It's like I wasn't so much interested in the totalitarians as a group. I was interested in the people who undertook the terrible acts that the totalitarians required. The people who, I was just rereading Ordinary Men, and it was a story about a police battalion in Poland that trained ordinary policemen to take naked pregnant women out into the fields and shoot them in the back of the head. It takes a lot of training, by the way, before you can bring yourself to do that. And you aren't the same person by the end of it. It's pretty goddamn horrific. And I was trying to figure out, what would it be like to be that person? Because we are that person. And then what would it be like to not be that person? Right? To refuse to do that, to not participate in that. And what I discovered by making that totalitarian proclivity personal was that there's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is, bent on our destruction, bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody, back as far as you can look, as malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart, and that's plenty malevolent. The possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in stir qualinus inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up straight and face the darkness, like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough and you didn't shy away and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror. I have people writing to me from all over the world who are saying they're doing that. They're saying, well, I cleaned up my room and then I stopped saying stupid things, and my God, it's like, things are way better. It's like, who would have guessed it? And so it's low-hanging fruit, man. Because that's the other thing. If there's a lot of things wrong with you, then it's really easy to start fixing it, You got there's so much territory that you can inhabit. I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee. That's good. I mean, the whole nation thing, that's positive. But to have God on your side, that's, you might want that when things get rough. That would be good. And make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Wonderful. That's a good deal. And I will bless them that bless thee. That's good too. And curse him that curses thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. That's something. That's something. Wouldn't it be something if you could wake up and your day was composed in part of people thanking you for all the good things you've done in the world? Wouldn't that be good? It's not impossible for that to happen. So Abram departed. Yes, as the Lord had spoken unto him. And Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years when he departed out of Haran. That's old. Now Abraham lives a long time, but this is also part of the story. So he has a wife who can't have children. He has nothing. Obviously, he's been hanging around Dad's shack for a little too long, given that he's 75, right? It's time to get a fire lit underneath him a bit. And so he's not got much going for him, but he still decides to move forward. And I've seen this too, like if you don't have your destiny in hand by your time you're 30, it's rough. You start hurting. And if you don't have your destiny in hand by the time you're 40, then you really start hurting. And 40 is a real fork in the road. The fork in the road, that's always where you meet the devil, by the way. And that's because every time you have to make a decision, the possibility of evil beckons. That's why that is. I had a friend, I've told you a little about him, and he killed himself just after 40. He had had a book published with a very small press. He was quite a good writer, but he could not get himself together, and it hit him too hard at 40. And I'm not saying that it's hopeless at 40. I'm not saying that. And I'm not saying that partly because of these verses, but also partly because of what I've seen in my clinical practice. I've had people come to me who have had very chaotic and ill-spent lives, let's say, who were in that neighborhood of age. And it's true for people who are older as well, who then decided to make a real effort and to try to make where they were better, instead of being bitter about where they weren't, because that's the bitterness that really does you in. It's really not good. It's the opposite of gratitude. It's the manifestation of resentment. It makes you malevolent. It's very, very bad to be bitter. It's hell to be bitter. And if you're 40 and you're not successful, then you have to accept your lot, and you have to start to improve what's right in front of you. And if you do that, it doesn't take very long. It's quite interesting to watch people. Things can be a lot better in 6 months, and they can be way better in 2 years. It's a struggle, uphill struggle, but it's by no means impossible. And I don't know, again, what the limit of that is. I suppose it depends to some degree on the degree of your commitment. But anyway, so it's another indication of the real validity of this story. God isn't setting this up to be easy, right? Abraham's old, and his wife is old too, and more than that, she's barren. How is he going to be the father of nations? How is he going to be successful? Well, the initial departure point is insufficient, radically insufficient. And that's very inspiring, because it means that you can start from where you are. And it's worth asking yourself. It's like, drop what you're doing that's foolish, that you know is foolish, and pick an aim that's worthwhile, to make things better for yourself, like you're worth taking care of, like you're worth something, and to surround yourself with people who believe the same, and who are rejoicing in your accomplishments and unhappy when you fail, right? And you're comparing yourself to your accomplishments of yesterday and not to someone else's today, so that you're not jealous and bitter. And you put your own house in order so that you're not cursing the world when some of its disarray might be your fault. And you're trying to pursue something meaningful, and you're doing your best to tell the truth and all of that. And then you see what happens. Who the hell are you? You think you're a miracle of some bloody bizarre sort. We've been around for 3.5 billion years. Every single one of your relatives propagated successfully. And here you are, against all possible odds, in this world of hell in some sense, and bitterness and tyranny and malevolence. And yet God only knows what's inside you, this capacity for consciousness, the capacity to confront potential and to turn it into something good. That's us, man. That's the Western story. That's the individual as the cornerstone of the state. That's our responsibility, and it really is who we are. I wrote about this in Notes from Underground. It's a great book, very short book. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Compelling, dark read. It's the confession of a miserable, resentful, like murderously genocidal bureaucrat who evaluates his own soul, I suppose, and confesses his sins. And it's also a critique of the idea of utopia oriented towards security. And Dostoevsky, who was dealing with the set of ideas that are really tearing us apart culturally right now, this idea of a eventual utopia based on something like security and safety. Dostoevsky really objected to that back in this like 1860, a long time ago. He said, the thing about people that you don't really understand is that, he said, fundamentally we're ungrateful and we can curse. That's what distinguished us from the animals, which I thought was pretty damn comical. But he said something very interesting. He said, if you set up a utopia so that all people had to do was eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, that, yeah, right, Russian humor, that after a surfeit of that, after enough of that, which would happen quite quickly, people would just go mad just to break things, just so something unexpected and remarkable could happen, and that we're not built for security and safety, but for something, well, let's call it adventure, something like adventure. That's a good thing to know, because you don't want to suffer unduly. That seems reasonable. And you might think, because of that really what you want is happiness. But then Solzhenitsyn, for example, he wrote about what happened in the Gulag Archipelago under Stalin and said, if your goal is happiness, what are you going to do when the jackboots hammer down your door at 2 a.m. and haul you off to the prison camp, because you're not going to be happy there. And so, happiness is a boat that's easily capsized, and the waves are always there. And so if your philosophy is one of, say, impulsive happiness, same sort of thing Dostoevsky was pointing at, and Kierkegaard, then you're not prepared when all hell breaks loose. And all hell, it will absolutely 100% break through at some point in your life. And you're lucky if it won't be decades. It'll certainly be some of it, and it might be a lot of it. And for some of you, it's going to be damn near the whole thing. And so if what floats your boat is happiness, you're going to be capsized by the first decent wave. And so then you might ask yourself, what do you have instead of happiness that might be even more reliable? And I do think that adventure is more reliable than happiness. And in the Old Testament story of Abraham, founder of the Abrahamic faiths, and obviously what would you call it, a crucial figure in the development of world culture, Abraham is presented as a late bloomer, to say the least. He's like 83. People lived longer back then, at least so the story goes. And he had a very rich father by nomadic standards, and he could just sit around in the tent all day, and a doting mother and a rich father, he could just sit around in the tent all day and eat peeled grapes and busy himself with the continuation of the species. And but God appears to him and says, Get away, get out of your security, get out of your comfort. Leave your family, leave your community, leave your nation, go out into the world. And it's a very interesting story. It's very interesting to contemplate it from both a psychological and a religious perspective, because what God is presented as in that book, which is a crucial book as I said, for world culture, is God is presented as the manifestation of the Spirit that calls even the too secure and pampered to adventure. Abraham has a pretty rough time when he goes out and has his adventure. It's not all, Skittles and roses from then on in. Quite the contrary. And he runs right away into like a conspiracy of elites to steal his wife. He runs into tyranny, runs into starvation. He encounters war. It's like he goes out in the world and he has the whole tragedy of his life, both on the social and political front and individually, you know. But the promise is the promise of adventure, and the implication is that if you have a sufficient adventure, then that cannot so much protect you from suffering, because perhaps that is impossible, but to justify it. And because you kind of know this in your own life. When you look at your life, you might look back on travails that you've undertaken, you know, and they've done end-of-life surveys with people and asked them what they regret. And, you know, people don't regret what they did that didn't work. They regret what they didn't do that could have worked, you know. They regret the chances they didn't take. And, you know, even if you do an evaluation of your biography, one of the things that you want to be able to say to yourself is something like, maybe there's nothing better you can say to yourself than this. You can think about this for yourself and see if it's true. That was extraordinarily difficult, but it was worth it. And, you know, it's not like you can have one of those without the other, because you can't imagine that you could have some confidence in what you've managed to accomplish, right? The kind of confidence that would instill you with a certain genuine sense of self-regard despite your fundamental inadequacy. To have that fundamental sense of self-regard that's grounded in something real, it has to be based in a narrative that approximates that was extremely difficult, but it was worth it. You have to have both of those. And so that's interesting, because one of the questions we always ask ourselves, this is the theodicy question, technically. You see the suffering in the world, you see the suffering of children, you see maybe your own children or your suffering, and you wonder, well, how can reality be constituted so that I can have faith in its essence when there is so much suffering? And one answer to that is something like, well, how much suffering do you want? And you might think, none. It's like, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's right. You want, at least you want something approximating optimized challenge. So you could say, at least you want to be pushed to your limit. And maybe you find the most exciting times in your life, in fact, you'll pay for this, you'll pay to have this experience, to be pushed to your limit, like not beyond it, or maybe even a bit beyond it, you know, and maybe not so far beyond it that you crumble and break and things fall apart, but, you know, could you be pushed to your limit optimally if there wasn't the possibility of falling apart and breaking? Like, that's an open question. How are you ever going to take something seriously if the consequences aren't actually serious? You know, and there's something delightful about dancing on the edge. That's why Hawaiians believed that surfing was sacred, you know, and it's because to surf you have to be on the edge, right? And the waves can come and take you out at any moment, but without the possibility of the waves rising to take you out, then you can't dance on the edge, and maybe that's exactly what you want to do, you know, and there's good evidence from the neuroscience literature that consciousness itself is something akin to dancing on the edge. So technically, when you're conscious, when you're awake, your brain is occupying a position between something. It's a position that's something like between chaos and order. And if your brain's maximally ordered, well, you're just bored and nothing is changing. And if you're chaotic, then it's anxiety and catastrophe. But you want to be positioned right between those two, and that's when your consciousness is optimized, you know. And when your consciousness is optimized, then you're deeply engaged in life, and everything seems alive and meaningful. And maybe that's the solution in some profound sense to the problem of suffering. It's that you optimize your interaction with chaos rather than being protected all the time from everything that could hurt you. You kind of know this too if you have kids, because you don't want to keep your kids in an infantile state, and because when they're infants, pretty much what you do with them, say they're 6 months and younger, is you just keep them secure and safe, right? You just provide everything that you can for them. You have to do that because, well, what are they going to do? They just lay there fundamentally and squawk now and then. I mean, it's not like they're ambulatory. They can't go out and do things for themselves, and so it's up to you, and your goal is to keep them secure and safe. But once they start being able to move around, then increasingly it's sort of up to them. And if you have any sense as a parent, the psychoanalysts used to say, the good mother necessarily fails. And what did they mean by that? They meant, well, if you're committed to your infant when you're a mother, for the first 6 months, it's like it's all the kid, 100%, full self-sacrifice devoted towards the infant. That's the right attitude. But even by 9 months, child can crawl around quite a lot. They're developing something of an independent will. You start handing them challenges. You start handing them responsibility, and you keep them on the edge. And some of your kids are going to be able to be pushed harder than others. And part of the reason you have to develop a relationship with your kids, and your husband for that matter, is so that, you can keep them dancing on the edge, on the proper edge. And that's even better than the mere provision of security.
Imagine that you're miserable, and then imagine that you're miserable in your marriage. And then you might say, well, are you miserable because you're ill-constituted psychologically, or are you miserable because your relationship isn't what it should be? And the answer is both. And so then you might ask yourself as well, do you think you could be sane for any length of time if you went through your life and you had no intimate relationship, and you had no children and the close family bonds that would entail, and you had no parents or siblings, and you had no friends, and you had no social community whatsoever? Could you still be well integrated psychologically? And the answer to that is clearly no. We know, for example, that you can punish people intensely, even if they're very antisocial, by subjecting them to solitary confinement. And that in itself shows how dependent psychological well-being and sanity is on proper nesting within a hierarchically structured social community. And so then it's probably better to think of both identity and sanity in a rather musical manner. In a great symphony, every note and every phrase has its place within the totality that's defined by the whole of the piece, and every part plays its part in the magnificence of the whole, let's say. And so if you're a popular child, you can play well with others, and that means that you can adopt shared and socially negotiated frameworks of identity. And if you're a well-constituted and popular and desirable adult, in all likelihood, you have a long-term intimate relationship. You have children or siblings and parents, and you've established good relations with them, and you keep each other mutually in check and mutually motivated and mutually sane. And then you have friends who are surrounding you, who are contributing to that sanity, and then your family and your friends and your marriage are integrated into a broader community, and maybe you adopt your civic identity in relationship to that broader community, as all of you are doing tonight, merely by attending this event. You've decided that you're going to step outside the narrow confines of your subjectively defined identity and contribute in some manner to the integrity of the whole and all its parts. And then above the local civic community is the level of the state, and then the level of the nation, and then the level of the international order. And all of those have to be in sync and in harmony in some real sense for any individual within that entire hierarchy to be truly sane. How sane do you think you could be in the middle of a war fought between your nation and another nation? And I'm afraid you all might have the opportunity to find out sooner rather than later, although I hope that that's not the case. And so I predicated the Conservative Manifesto on the proposition that what conservatives have to offer young people is a much more comprehensive view of what constitutes identity than this idiot solipsistic claim that you define yourself subjectively like a 2-year-old, and that you can demand that people treat you according to how you feel, whatever that means, in opposition to the identity that you would negotiate as a fair player with other people. And so conservatives can say to young people, look, you want to find meaning in your life. You want to find a meaning that sustains you through catastrophe. You want to be able to be a resilient person. You want to have worthwhile things to do. And you're going to find that primarily in the service that you grant to others and in the responsibility that you voluntarily shoulder. And that's a much different story than you get to be whatever you want moment to moment because of how you feel, and that all constraints placed on your hedonic short-term self-satisfaction are to be regarded as nothing but the manifestation of power and tyranny. That's such a demoralizing viewpoint, especially for young people. When you talk to anybody who's a little older and maybe has the wisdom that goes along with age, if they're fortunate, they know perfectly well that the most of the significant and sustaining meaning that they've found in their life is a consequence of reciprocal service to others and voluntarily undertaken responsibility. That shouldn't be regarded as a limit in some sense on the quality of your life. People think of marriage as a unnecessary, bureaucratic-ridden patriarchal arrangement that's nothing but oppression, and they think of children as nothing but excess responsibility, and that's utter rubbish. You could make the same case, I suppose, about career and education. It's like, those are opportunities, man. And they're opportunities to do something significant with your life. And you're going to need to do that because you're going to encounter periods of suffering, intense suffering, when it's difficult for you to make sense out of the logic of existence. And what you'll have in those situations is, if you're fortunate, you'll have the goodwill that you've generated as a consequence of being an upstanding, productive, and generous individual and citizen. And then perhaps you'll have a little arc that can sustain you through the worst storms of your life. And this is something that conservatives really can tell to young people, is you're going to find the sustaining meaning of your life through responsibility. And that is the case. I certainly saw that time and again as a clinical psychologist in all my practice, helping people sort out the desperate chaos of isolated and lonely lives, pointless lives, lives that were expended in futile isolation and in resentful rebelling against the imposition of any responsible order, instead of carrying that forthrightly and understanding how integrally that voluntary commitment is associated with sustaining meaning. And you're going to need it. And mark my words. I think the way you do that, the way you restore the moral authority of your nation, is by restoring your moral authority and your moral authority in relationship to the relationships that you have. Get your act together. You know, your nation is founded on the principle that each person is a sovereign citizen and a creator of the future, and someone who's made in the image of God, someone who wrestles the chaos of possibility into habitable order using love and truth. And the reason you have the rights you have is because those rights are, in some sense, fundamental consequences of that divine capacity. And you might ask, well, do you believe that? Well, to the degree that you abide by the dictates of your state, and to the degree that you treat other people as if they're worthwhile in and of themselves, then you do believe it. And I would say, well, believe it fully. Act it out. Put yourself together. Don't lie. Pick up your responsibility and move forward as forthrightly as you possibly can. Repair your relationships. And if enough people do that, then America will reestablish the moral authority that's required and requisite. And I don't think there's any other way of doing it. You know, the leftists talk about the long march through the institutions because they tend to be top-down power mongers on the radical left front. And there's a longer march, which is the long march through the individuals. And that's the march that conservatives and centrist liberals need to focus on. Redemption is an individual issue in many regards, even though we have to be nested in our social communities. And it's an individual responsibility. So evaluate your sins and clean them up and sort out your relationships. And then you can expand outward into the civic community and you can have a positive influence there. And there's no other way of doing it that's real. All the rest of it's just facade and treachery.
And I had another client who could be lucid in her dreams, which is more common among women. She could ask the damn characters what they represented and they would tell her. It was like, okay, that was pretty weird. And like a lot of the things they told her were really helpful, and they were not things that she wanted to hear. She basically, one of them told her if she was going to live, she'd have to go visit a slaughterhouse. And the reason for that was because she was raised as a little princess and protected from horrible Mother Nature until she hit puberty, in which time she turned into an evil villain, because that's how the family worked. Perfect child, evil teenager, overnight. And then, well, that was hard on her, and she wasn't prepared because she thought the world was princess world, and you know, she couldn't go through a butcher store without having a fit. And no wonder, you know, like really, Jesus, you know, it's no wonder, but you do it. But she couldn't, so we used to go to butcher stores, and that would make her cry, and that she was a vegetarian, that would make her cry, and you know, bemoan the cruelty of the world. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, man, those are bloody slabs of meat. It's like, I don't know why everyone isn't screaming when they walk through the butcher store, but you got to get used to it, man, because you can't live in the world otherwise. And so the dream character, who was a gypsy, told her that she had to go visit a slaughterhouse, which seemed rather impractical. And so I asked her if she could think of anything else to do, and she thought, well, why don't we go visit a funeral home and watch an embalming? And I thought, oh, good, that sounds like a fun way to spend a day. And so I phoned up a funeral parlor, and I said I had a client who was terrified of death. Yeah, and I was a therapist who was also a little shaky on the concept myself. And so they had no problem with that. They deal with death all the time, which is really something to think about, right? A human being can actually have an occupation where they do nothing but deal with death, and they don't go stark raving mad. It's like, what the hell's up with that? It's like working in a palliative care ward where your clients that you know have a relationship, all they're going to do is die this week, next week, the week after. People do that. It's like, those people are tough, man. They're tough. So anyways, we went and watched this embalming, which was, I have a rather high level of disgust sensitivity, so it was a little on the rough side for me. But she sat there, and first while she was not, we were outside this little room, she was not looking at that, man, no way. And she'd kind of go like this, and you know, that was pretty good. And then she'd go like this, and then she'd go like this, and then she watched it. And then she asked if she could go in, and she put on a glove and she touched the body, and she didn't have a fit, she didn't have a panic attack. And so she walked away from there learning that there was a hell of a lot more to her than she thought there was, and that she could see things that she didn't think she could see and live. And after that, she sort of had a touchstone. It's like, well, I'm kind of afraid of this. Well, is it as bad as going to see the embalming? No, it's not that bad. Well, I guess I can do it. It's like an initiation, right? She had an initiation. And so did I, you know. And I learned a lot from doing that. I learned that one of the things you need to do if you're going to be a human being is to prepare yourself to be useful in the face of death. And so when you have a parent that dies, which, you know, shatters people's ideas, often they can't even think about it. If you can't even think about that, man, you've got some thinking to do. Because you need to be able to at least think about that, because otherwise you're just going to be a wasteland when it happens. And you never know, you could even have a higher ambition. Maybe you could even be useful when it happens, instead of being part of the heap of destroyed people who also have to be taken care of. You know, and that's brutal. You have to be brutal to be useful in the aftermath of your parents' death. You know, you don't get to crumble and fall apart, and no, you have every reason to. So you got to be kind of some tough monster to manage that. But do you want to be useful in the face of tragedy, or do you want to be pathetic?
I've worked in emergency medicine for 11 years, and I've seen a lot of death, yet I'm so afraid of dying. Any advice on how I can be at peace with dying and mortality?
Well, I don't know if anybody's ever really at peace with that. I mean, I think what you can take away, read Socrates' Apology. There's two versions of it. There's Plato's version, and there's, what was his name, Aristophanes? There's another version. Don't think that's right. Anyways, there's two versions of Socrates' Apology. It's very short. It's only a few pages long, 15 pages or something. Read them both. Why? Well, because Socrates puts forward a very interesting proposition, and I don't know really what to make of it. So I asked my parents once,
if they could take a drug that would return them to being 18 physically, but they had all the wisdom that they'd accrued over the years, they wouldn't lose that if they would do it. And they didn't say yes right away, you know, and I don't know if they ever did tell me what they had decided, but it was interesting to me that they didn't say no right away either, you know. It was interesting that they had to think about it, because you'd think that if you were offered something approximating immortality and health, you'd take it. And maybe you would, but then here's an alternative proposition, and I don't know. It's not like I'm not trying to maintain myself, you know. If I could extract out an extra decade or an extra 20 years keeping myself healthy, that seems like a good thing. Would I want to live 500 years? Whew, that's a long time, man. 1,000 years? I don't know. It's a long time. But the alternative is, you know, truncated existence with death. And that's also not particularly palatable. And so is there a medicament for mortality? Well, Socrates, but implicit in Socrates' apology is the following idea. Imagine you lived your life fully. And that would mean that you said what you had to say when you had to say it. You did what you needed to do when you needed to do it, and you availed yourself of every opportunity that came your way, right? So you'd exhaust yourself in the service of your life, let's say. Maybe by the time you were old, you'd have had enough, you know, and you could just let go. And, you know, you do see this with people, is that, and we kind of know this even when we grieve, you know, maybe you have a relative who's 95 and they die, and people are sad, but you say, well, you know, they lived a full life, and the fuller the life, the less, in some ways, the less catastrophic the demise appears to be. And so it might be that if you fully exhausted yourself, that your life would be enough. So I know, you know, people, I mentioned this already, people who are old and they look back on their life, they're often sorrowful and regretful for the things they didn't do, you know, the things they left undone and maybe now can't do. You know, you could imagine those of you who've been parents, maybe have grown kids now, you think, well, if you could have children again, would you? And maybe the answer is yes, but another answer is, well, you know, I had kids already. I already did that. And if you did that well, maybe that's enough. You know, we have grandkids now, and that's not exactly the same as having kids. It's sort of, it's kids light, right? And it's wonderful. But you made a joke about that when you were on stage. You know, you said they have all the advantages of children, grandchildren, with none of the disadvantages. And that's a joke, but everybody laughs because everybody gets that. And it's great to have grandchildren, and like, would we return to our youth and do it again? Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, right? Because you just don't have you can't tell what you decide unless that option was actually available to you. And maybe the answer is yes, and maybe the answer is no, because, you know, been there, done that, on to whatever the next thing is. And so I would say, if you're afraid of death, take a look at how you're living and see if you're all in. And maybe if you're all in enough, that's good enough. I think that's right. And then I think also, if you're all in and death visits, and you know it's impending, you could say to yourself, I did everything that I was here to do. At least then you're not going to torture yourself with that as you're facing death. That's something too. There's a couple of things that I'm doing that are different from what people usually do, you know. So in the last 20 years, the constant message to young people is self-esteem, feel good about yourself. It's like, I don't buy that. I think that you look at yourself in the mirror and you think, Jesus Christ, I could be a hell of a lot better than I am.
Yeah.
And so, and the thing is, there's nothing more complimentary to tell a young person than that. It's like, look at you, you're a wreck. Grow the hell up. There's so much more to you than you're manifesting than you can hardly imagine. It's like, well, you think that's a criticism. It's like, no, it's not. It's a great compliment. It's like, look at how much more you could bring out into the world.
Yeah.
Get your aggression under control. Strengthen yourself. Like, take on some responsibility. See if you have enough bloody courage to tell the truth. Put your life together. Stop whining. And the men eat that up because no one's ever told them that, which just breaks my heart.
Yeah.
It's so bad. And, you know, the boys are pulling out of everything. They're pulling out of university. They're pulling out of life. They're pulling out of marriage.
Yeah.
And because of that, they're more awkward and unsophisticated than they would otherwise be, and much more prone to make sexual errors, some of which are, you know, predatory malevolence in the small proportion of cases. But it's another one of those situations, you know, like, imagine that 1 in 100 men are sexual predators.
Yeah.
Probably, maybe it's 1 in 50, but let's go with 1 in 100. Well, that small proportion commit all of the sexual predation. Like, if you look at criminals, it's a Pareto distribution again. 5% of the criminals produce something like, well, the overwhelming majority of the crimes, right? It's a small coterie of specialized people who are responsible for all the criminality. Lots of people are in prison because they did one heinous thing, you know, like they got enraged or drunk and did something violent. But there's the serial criminal types, and they're the ones that like, we had one guy in Toronto, for example, who ran a bike theft ring, and they finally nailed him. And like, there weren't any bikes stolen in Toronto after that. It was just him and his little coterie of, you know, organized bike thieves. And these guys that are being outed, these serial predators, they are responsible. Like, one predatory guy can prey on, who knows, 500 females, 1,000 females in a lifetime, you know? So
it almost seems like, I mean, this is a lot of guys. I was one of these guys who sort of turned away from society for a while, like into computer games and like this slacker identity, which is sort of, I guess it's always been there. Like, you turn to like away from all responsibilities and you go to the dream world. But the opportunities to do this is so much larger now.
Well, it's the Lost Boys, like in Peter Pan, right? They're in Neverland and they never grow up. And Peter Pan is their leader. That's the story. And it's not surprising, because it's easier to occupy yourself trivially than it is to do something difficult.
What are the top 3 rules for being the best man I can be for the people I love?
Well, you know, rule number 1 is, ask that question. That's a good question. You know, that's a meditative and prayerful question. You know, I don't think there's any difference, by the way, between prayer and thought. I think that thought is secularized prayer. I think that's even true, like, evolutionarily and historically. And then the question is, what is prayer? And by implication, thought. And that is the opening up of yourself to revelation, and then the critical analysis of the revelation. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, when you think, you admit your ignorance, because why think if you're not ignorant? And you note that you have a problem, and you formalize the problem, which is to ask the question associated with the problem, and then you open yourself up for receipt of an answer. It's really important to get the question right. There's the first rule. Get the question right. That's a pretty good question. That question is, how am I the best father and husband in relationship to those I love? And then that has to be a question. And then you can ask yourself, think, okay, well, you know, how would have I liked my father to have conducted himself? And
how did fathers that I knew that I admired conduct themselves, and how did great men in history who would be models for fathers conduct themselves, and what is the eternal spirit of the redeeming father? Those are all the same question at different levels of depth. And if you ask yourself that question, you'll stumble towards a revelation of the answer. And then it's incumbent on you to embody that, to act it out. You could ask a different question. What stupid things am I doing that I could stop doing, that I would stop doing, both, that I could stop doing, that I would stop doing, that are interfering with me being that? And man, that's a great question to ask yourself every morning. You know, what stupid thing am I doing that I could quit doing? That I would quit doing? Because those aren't the same thing, right? Because you know there's stupid things that you're doing that you're just not going to quit doing because you like them. But there might be something on the edge there where, weak and useless as you are, you could stop that. And you know, part of the reason I wrote this one rule here, the first book, I think it was, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Well, why did I formulate it like that? It's like, well, you can't tell the truth because, like, what the hell do you know? But some of the things you say are lies, and you know it, and some of the lies that you tell, you could just stop telling. Well, start with that. You know, incremental death and regrowth. Incremental death and rebirth. And you let the lies die, and you let something new emerge instead, right? That's the resurrection. So you let the spirit of deceit perish, and you let the eternal spirit of redemption arise in its place. And that's really good for you, and it's really good for your wife. It'll spice up your sex life like mad, and because she'll actually want to have you around. And that's kind of useful if you're trying to seduce someone, even your wife, who you might think is otherwise obligated, and perhaps she is, but I don't know how much fun that is. Obligatory sex. It's like, that's not a very good idea. And it'll be really good for your kids, and maybe there's enough to you so that it won't just be good for you and your wife and your kids, but maybe it'll be good for your friends, and then maybe for your community, and who knows what would happen if you really got your act together. You know, like there is this weird idea that's central to our culture that because we're all of divine value, that we have the spark of God himself within us. And but we don't allow that to make itself manifest because we lack the courage and the faith. And yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so it's an open question, you know, if you as a father decided you were going to take the bushel off your light, and that'd be great for your kids, you know. And one of the things you got to understand about your kids, this is really worth knowing. Your kids want to have the best relationship with you that they possibly could have. Like they're 100% on board with that idea. Way more than anyone you've ever met in your life. And that means you could have the best relationship with your children that you've ever had with anyone. That's what they offer you. And it's up to you to realize that, and you could. And that's a hell of that's a good opportunity, man. You know, even if you've been beat around a lot and betrayed and hurt, you've got those little kids and they're thinking, what do you want to do, Dad? You know, and if you're bitter, that'll cut you to the quick and you'll hurt them. You don't want to do that. what you find out in your life when you're young, and you need to know this, all of you, is that you need to get good at least one thing. So you need to get very good at least one thing. You have to specialize in something. And that was really the point of an apprenticeship, right? Because you subject yourself to a master, and I'll use that term despite its connotations, let's say. You subjected yourself voluntarily to the discipline imposed in a single direction. The philosopher Nietzsche pointed out that nothing of any value could be attained, even on the front of freedom, without first subjecting yourself to intense voluntary discipline. And so he thought of voluntary slavery in some sense as the precondition for freedom. And you can think about that. Imagine that you're trying to learn to play a musical instrument. Or imagine what you had to go through when you learned to read. There's that initial process of skill automation, which is very painstaking and difficult. But once you master it, to pass through that disciplinary structure, then you have freedoms that you wouldn't have had before. Once you learn to read music and to position your hands properly on the piano keyboard and to play the appropriate scales and chords, then you can play music, and you couldn't do that to begin with. And so the subjugation of yourself to a disciplinary structure actually frees you. This is another thing conservatives have to tell young people. And then the other thing you'll note, that you do note as you get older, if you've gone through a disciplinary process or a multitude of them, is that they first narrow you as you specialize, but then as you get deeper and deeper into your specialization, the world broadens out in front of you. And so, for example, when I went off to do my PhD, I studied alcoholism. But in order to study alcohol and its effects on the brain, I had to study neuroscience and neuropsychology. And once I started studying neuroscience and neuropsychology, neuropharmacology for that matter as well, then I had to understand, well, turns out I had to understand, at least to the degree I was capable, the functioning of the entire brain, because alcohol washes the entire brain like water. And so I had to write a thesis, which is a disciplinary process, focused particularly on the genetic predisposition among males with multi-generational family histories of alcoholism to alcohol reward. And that's a very specific topic, but it didn't matter, because as I got deeper and deeper into it, it started to reconnect to the whole world. And so it's extremely useful for you to master something. Pick something, or more than one thing, but start with something. And in some sense, it doesn't really matter what it is, it just matters that you do it. And what'll happen is you'll also develop the discipline that goes along with that process of self-mastery. And once you have that discipline instantiated because you subjected yourself voluntarily to a particular goal, you can take that discipline and subject yourself to other goals as a consequence. And so you don't have to worry that if you become a master of one thing, you become a jack of no trades. The greatest people I've met, I knew a great artist in Montreal. He was a very good friend of mine. And he was a licensed taxi driver and a licensed carpenter and a licensed boat pilot and a great interior decorator and extremely skilled socially and a great visual artist. He had that all at his fingertips, and that was multiple masters. He had served multiple masters and become a master himself.
It's okay to wander around stupidly before you fix your destination. Now you see that echoed in Exodus, right? Because what happens is that the Egyptians, or the Hebrews, escape a tyranny, which is kind of whatever you do personally and psychologically when you escape from your previous set of stupidly held and ignorant and stubborn axioms. It's like, away from that tyranny. It's like, great, I freed myself from that. Well, then what? Well, you think, well, now I'm on the way. It's, no, you're not. Now you're in the desert, where you wander around stupidly, and worship the wrong things until you finally organize yourself morally again and head in the proper direction. So that's worth knowing too, because you think, well, I got rid of a lot of things, baggage, excess baggage that I didn't need in my life, and now everything's okay. It's like, no, it's not. You've got rid of a whole set of scaffolds that were keeping you in place, even though they were pathological. And now you have nothing, and nothing actually turns out to be better than something pathological, but you're still stuck with the problem of nothing. And that's exactly why Exodus is structured the way that it is. It's that you escape from a tyranny, it's hooray, we're no longer slaves. Yeah, well, now you're nihilistic and lost. It's not necessarily an improvement. But it is see, it's also useful to know that, because you can also be deluded into the idea that, imagine that you're trying to become enlightened, which might mean to turn all those parts of you on that could be turned on. You think, well, that's just a linear pathway uphill. You know, it's just from one success to another. No, it's not. It's like, here you are and you're not doing too badly, and the first step is a complete bloody catastrophe. It's worse. And then maybe you can pull yourself together and you hit a new plateau, and then that crumbles and shakes, and bang, it's worse again. And so, because part of the reason that people don't become enlightened is because it's punctuated by intermittent deserts, essentially, by intermittent catastrophes. And if you don't know that, well, then you're basically screwed, because you go ahead on your movement forward and you collapse and you think, well, that didn't work, I collapsed. It's like, no, that's par for the course. It's not indication that you failed, it's just indication that it's really hard. And that when you learn something, you also unlearn something. And the thing you unlearned is probably useful, and unlearning it actually is painful. You know, let's say if you have to get out of a bad relationship. It's like there isn't any relationship that's 100% bad. And so when you jump out of it, well, maybe you're in better shape, but you're still lonesome and disoriented, and you don't know what your past was, and you don't know what your present is, and you don't know what your future is. That's why people stay with the devil they know, instead of, you know, looking for the devil they don't know. So anyways, the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean you have to stop. And thank God for that. That's a really useful thing. And the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean that you can't learn. And so you can posit an ideal, and you're going to be wrong about it, but it doesn't matter, because what you're right about is positing the ideal, moving towards it. If the actual ideal isn't conceptualized perfectly, well, first, surprise, surprise, because like, what are you going to do that's perfect? So it doesn't matter that it's imperfect. It just matters that you do it and that you move forward. So that's really positive news as far as I'm concerned, because you can actually do that, right? You can do it badly. Anyone can do that. So that's useful. Okay, so like if you were an efficient person, you would have just done that. But you're not. But who cares? You know, you still end up in the same place. And maybe the trip is even more interesting. Who knows? Probably too interesting. Jung. I began to understand that the goal of psychic development, by which he means psychological development or spiritual development, is the self. There's no linear evolution. There's only a circumambulation of the self, a getting closer. It's like you're spiraling into something. Something like that. And the thing that you're spiraling into recedes as you move towards it, and gets more and more sophisticated and well developed as you move towards it, because you're not going to run out of goals, right? No matter how much you have your act together, there's probably, undoubtedly, 30 dimensions along which you could get your act together a lot more. So, and some of those aren't even conceivable to you when you're in your initial uncarved state, let's say.
You start the journey toward becoming a master by subjecting yourself to other masters. And that's really what you're supposed to do when you get educated, particularly in the humanities, because that's a apprenticeship with masters. And so you might think, like people often think when they won't discipline their children, that if you constrain your creativity in a single direction, you're going to eradicate your flexibility and your creativity, but you won't. You'll just bring order to your chaos. And once you do that, all that creative potential that you have within you will be much more likely to manifest itself. So it's very useful to seriously discipline yourself voluntarily, especially when you're young. You can find out what constraints you can abide within. You can find out how hard you can push yourself. You can find out how hard you can work. You can find out how productive and generous you can be. And all that's unbelievably useful. And then you can dial it back a bit so it becomes sustainable, you know. But it's good to wear yourself right to the bone if you can while you're young, so you start to understand who you are. And you can't do that without pushing yourself right to the limit.